My wife filed for divorce, convinced I was too poor to hire a lawyer. But when she walked into the courtroom, she didn't know my older brother, the most dangerous lawyer in the state, was already sitting at the defendant's table. It was the last mistake of her life. My wife, Isabella, delivered the news on a humid Tuesday evening in our penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay. We had spent the last 7 years curating a life of quiet luxury in the heart of Miami, turning a cold condo into a sanctuary of mid-century modern design and warmth. When she finally spoke, there was no tremor in her voice, only the cold, rehearsed precision of a venture capitalist finalizing a hostile takeover. She placed a sleek folder on the Italian marble coffee table, informing me that the marriage was finished and that she had already retained counsel. Her demands were not a starting point for negotiation. They were a blueprint for my total financial annihilation. She laid out her terms with a terrifying lack of hesitation. She wanted the keys to the penthouse, which had been secured primarily through a trust my late father established for me years ago. She demanded the lion's share of our combined brokerage accounts, citing the need for lifestyle stability, and insisted on alimony that would have effectively drained my professional income as a high-end architectural consultant for the next decade. She watched me with a patronizing, pitying smile, clearly enjoying the sight of me absorbing the blow. She reminded me that my work was respectable but modest, and that in the shark-infested waters of Miami's legal circuit, I stood absolutely no chance. She claimed her attorney was a ruthless specialist who would bury me in litigation costs long before I could even explain my side to a judge. Her advice was for me to simply sign the papers and disappear into the night, keeping whatever scraps remained. As I sat there, the heat from the Miami summer seemed to press against the glass walls, mirroring the suffocating weight of her betrayal. I looked at the woman I had spent nearly a decade loving, realizing that her cruelty wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a calculated strategy. She viewed my gentle demeanor and my preference for low-key work as fundamental weaknesses. In her mind, I was a static object, an obstacle to be cleared on her path to a more lucrative, high-profile existence. I remained silent, letting the heavy, stagnant air fill the room, eventually offering only a brief, hollow affirmation of her demands. The relief that washed over her was palpable. She stood up, checked her reflection in the darkened window, and exited the penthouse, leaving me with the folder and a crushing sense of isolation. She believed she had performed a perfect strategic strike. She knew I lacked the capital to sustain a protracted legal battle, and she was certain that my primary leverage, my older brother, Julian, was permanently out of reach. Julian was not like me. He was a titan in the South Florida legal community, a man whose presence in a courtroom commanded immediate, nervous silence. He was, by any objective metric, the most expensive and feared divorce attorney in the state, a man who viewed litigation as a blood sport. 5 years earlier, following the death of our mother, we had engaged in a vicious, public confrontation regarding the disposition of our family estate in Coral Gables. My desire to preserve the historic property as a family legacy had clashed violently with Julian's cold, pragmatic drive to liquidate the asset. We had not spoken a single word to one another since that day, leaving me, in Isabella's estimation, completely stripped of any meaningful defense. She was banking on my pride keeping me silent while she dismantled my life. She could not have been more wrong. For 3 days, the silence in the penthouse was absolute. A crushing, suffocating void that mirrored the disintegration of my world. Isabella had calculated correctly. I could not fight her on her turf, and the prospect of losing my home and my legacy felt like drowning in the deep waters off South Beach. But on the 4th day, as the intensity of the humidity broke into a torrential downpour, I reached my breaking point. I realized that my pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My hands were steady for the first time in days as I scrolled through my contacts to find the private line I hadn't touched in half a decade. When he answered, his voice carried the same sharp, commanding weight that had once intimidated our childhood peers. I didn't waste time with formalities. I laid out the situation with brutal, unvarnished honesty, Isabella's demands, her arrogance, the threats regarding her high-priced counsel, and her assumption that I was a broken man with no resources. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. But when he finally spoke, the clinical, detached tone was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering intensity that I hadn't felt from him since we were boys. He didn't ask me to explain why I had waited so long. He simply demanded to know when and where the initial hearing was set. I gave him the time and the location of the downtown courthouse. He told me to keep my head down, to sign nothing, and to be there. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Miami was a bruised, heavy gray. I arrived at the courthouse feeling like a ghost, walking into the sterile, air-conditioned room where my future was meant to be finalized. Isabella was already there, looking like the victor in a perfectly tailored cream suit, laughing quietly with her attorney, a man whose smug confidence was as predictable as the rising tide. When they spotted me, their expressions shifted to a performative, condescending pity. I sat at the defendant's table alone, clutching my briefcase, feeling the weight of their judgment. Isabella's lawyer sauntered over, his voice dripping with forced empathy as he suggested that I simply accept the inevitable, sign the documents, and save us. He reached my table, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and sat down with the definitive, bone-chilling thud of his briefcase. Isabella's face had drained of all color, her composure shattering instantly. Her lawyer, once so full of bluster, looked as though he were staring into the abyss. Julian didn't waste a second. He stood up, addressed the judge with a voice like polished steel, and, in a single sentence, obliterated the entire narrative Isabella had crafted. He looked directly at her, his eyes cold and devoid of mercy, and informed the room that he wasn't there for a fee. He was there for his brother. The hunt had officially begun. The months that followed were not a court case. They were a systematic dismantling of every lie Isabella had built. Julian moved through the legal landscape with the terrifying efficiency of a hurricane. He didn't just file motions. He launched a total offensive. While her attorney tried to hide behind procedural technicalities, Julian filed for a comprehensive discovery that ripped through every facet of Isabella's financial life. He demanded logs of every cent that had touched our accounts, every digital transaction, and every private message. When her team fought back, claiming the request was invasive, Julian simply presented a case to the judge that framed her secrecy as direct evidence of premeditated fraud. The judge, clearly aware that denying Julian was a path to professional disaster, approved the motion without hesitation. While the paperwork piled up, Julian turned his attention to the people in Isabella's orbit. He didn't just question her. He spent weeks systematically dismantling the credibility of her inner circle. He scheduled depositions with the precision of a surgeon, cornering her closest associates until their loyalty crumbled under the pressure of his relentless, polite, and devastating cross-examinations. The turning point came during the questioning of her best friend, a woman who had been integral to Isabella's secret life. Julian sat her down, maintained a calm, terrifying composure, and then produced a stack of records from a hidden account I never knew existed, a siphon for our shared assets that had been fueling Isabella's double life for over a year. He didn't need to shout to get the truth. He only needed to present the evidence and wait. The moment he pressed her on the identity of a man named Marcus Vance, the facade shattered. Under the weight of the evidence and the looming threat of perjury, she broke. The story emerged in agonizing detail. Marcus was a high-end real estate developer, and he and Isabella had been involved for nearly 2 years. They hadn't just been having an affair. They had been architects of my ruin, planning the divorce as a business transaction to fund their future together. They had even coordinated the specific demands, convinced that my lack of wealth would render me unable to defend myself. When Julian brought the same pressure to bear on her lover during a subsequent deposition, the man's arrogance evaporated the moment he saw the depth of our intelligence. He admitted to everything, effectively proving that the entire divorce petition was founded on perjury and systemic deceit. Isabella's lawyer, realizing the absolute catastrophe he was presiding over, attempted to retreat into a settlement, but Julian refused to engage. He informed them that a settlement was a courtesy they no longer deserved. We were headed to the final hearing, and his only objective now was total scorched earth victory. The balance of power had shifted so violently that Isabella was no longer a plaintiff in a divorce. She was a defendant in a war she had triggered and was now utterly powerless to end. The final day in court arrived under a relentless Miami sun, but the temperature inside the courtroom was glacial. Faced with the mountain of evidence Julian had amassed, the forensic accounting reports, the proof of her perjury, and the digital trail of her conspiracy, Isabella was reduced to a shell of the woman who had once stood in our penthouse with a smug smirk. Her attorney, now gaunt and hollow-eyed, did not even attempt to argue. He simply urged her to accept the terms Julian placed before her. It was not a settlement. It was an absolute surrender. The decree was comprehensive and brutal. Isabella left the marriage with absolutely nothing to show for her efforts. She was barred from any claim to the penthouse. Her demands for spousal support were dismissed with prejudice, and the court ordered her to pay back every cent of the $60,000 she had siphoned from our joint assets for her illicit affairs. Her attempt to strip mine our life for her own gain had ended in her own financial and social ruin. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Her lover, a man who valued his own social standing above all else, discarded her the moment the scandal became public. Her circle of friends, many of whom had been first to witness her lies crumble under oath, evaporated. In a single stroke, she had lost everything: the home, the lifestyle, the security, and the reputation she had spent years carefully constructing. Yet, for me, the true victory occurred weeks later, far away from the sterile confines of the law. I drove out to our family estate in Coral Gables, the same property that had been the silent witness to our 5-year silence. Julian was waiting for me on the porch, the golden hour light casting long shadows across the old wood. We did not discuss the legal wreckage we had left behind. We spoke instead of our father's old boat, the quiet mornings we spent as children, and the simple, honest memories we had allowed to become buried under layers of ego and stubborn pride. In the long, cooling silence that followed, Julian finally broke the stalemate. He spoke of his own regrets, of how his obsession with the asset had cost him the sibling who actually mattered. I admitted my own failures, acknowledging that I had been too entrenched in my own sentimentality to see the possibility of a different future. We reached a mutual understanding that the estate would remain ours, a project for us to restore together rather than a trophy to be sold or a tomb to be ignored. As we worked side by side in the following weeks, refinishing the old floors and breathing life back into the house, I realized that Isabella had ultimately failed in her primary goal. She had tried to isolate me, to leave me with nothing, but in her desperate arrogance, she had inadvertently forced me to make the one call that reunited me with the only family that truly mattered. I have finally found my footing again, standing on solid ground, with my home secured and my brother standing firmly by my side.